The gavel came down like a verdict, and Alara Whitmore felt the sound in her chest before she understood its meaning. Sold, the auctioneer said, though no one in the crowded hall dared call it that aloud. The lady's debts, in full, to Lord Cassius Thorne. Alara stood at the edge of the room in a gray dress that had once been blue, her hands folded so tightly that her knuckles had gone white. She had known this moment was coming for weeks, ever since her father's creditors had descended on the house like crows on a fresh grave. She had told herself she was prepared for it. She was not. Lord Thorne rose from his seat near the front of the hall, adjusting his gloves with the unhurried calm of a man who had never once in his life been told no. He was not old, but there was something old in the way he looked at her, something that made her skin want to crawl off her bones and hide. "Come along then," he said, as though she were a parcel he had purchased and was now mildly inconvenienced to carry home. Alara did not move. Around her, the hall smelled of dust and old wax, of too many bodies pressed together in too small a space to watch another person's ruin. She had grown up in rooms like this, attending sales with her father when he still had money to spend rather than debts to hide, and she had never once imagined that she herself would stand at the center of one, an object to be tallied and claimed. The thought made something cold settle low in her stomach, colder even than her fear of the man now walking toward her. "I said come along. I heard you the first time, my lord." A ripple of quiet laughter passed through the hall, quickly smothered. Thorne's jaw tightened. He took a step toward her, and Alara felt her heart lurch, because she knew what happened to people who defied Cassius Thorne in public. She had heard the stories. She had seen the bruises on a maid who once worked in his house, before the maid stopped coming to work at all. "My lord," a new voice said, calm and unhurried, cutting through the tension like a blade through silk. "I believe there has been a change in circumstance." Every head in the hall turned. The man who had spoken was tall, dressed in unrelieved black but for the silver at his throat, and he moved through the crowd the way water moves around stone, without effort, without apology. Alara did not recognize him. She had never seen him before in her life, and yet something in her chest tightened at the sight of him, some old and nameless instinct she could not explain. "Your Grace," the auctioneer said, and bowed so low his nose nearly touched his knee. "We were not informed you intended to bid." "I did not intend to," the Duke said, "until I heard the sum." Thorne's eyes narrowed. "This is not your concern, Vane." "It is now." The Duke reached into his coat and withdrew a folded note, which he handed to the auctioneer without breaking his gaze from Thorne's face. "The lady's debts, paid in full, and then some, I believe, given the interest you have no doubt already added without her knowledge." The hall went utterly silent. Thorne's face had gone the color of old parchment. "You cannot simply—" "I can, and I have." The Duke's voice did not rise, did not sharpen, but there was something underneath it, something like the low growl of a dog that has decided, quite calmly, that it will bite. "Unless you wish to contest the transaction in a court of law, my lord, in which case I would be delighted to discuss, in great detail, the manner in which you have acquired your last 3 wards." Thorne said nothing. He looked at Alara once more, a long, cold, cataloging look, the kind a man gives something he has lost and intends to reclaim later. Then he turned on his heel and walked out of the hall, his footsteps echoing sharp against the marble. For a long moment, no one in the hall moved. The auctioneer looked between the departing lord and the note still folded in his hand, as though uncertain which man he ought to fear more. Then, slowly, the ordinary business of the room began again, murmured conversation rising like water filling a basin, and Alara understood that whatever had just happened to her, it was already becoming a story others would tell over supper, a small scandal to season their evening. Alara let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. The Duke turned to her, and for the first time she saw his face properly, without the crowd between them. He was younger than she had expected, and there was a tiredness around his eyes that did not belong to a man of his years, a tiredness that spoke of some old grief he had not yet set down. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "I am the Duke of Ashgrove. I do not believe we have been introduced." Something in the way he said her name made her breath catch, though she could not have said why. "You know my name. It was on the ledger." He nodded toward the auctioneer's table. "Along with the sum you apparently owe half of London for. I confess I did not expect to spend my afternoon settling a stranger's debts." "Then why did you?" The Duke was quiet for a moment. His gaze moved over her face, lingered there in a way that was not quite proper and not quite improper either, a way that made her feel he was searching for something he had misplaced. "I am not entirely certain," he said finally. Call it an aversion to watching a man like Thorn collect another possession he has no right to. It was not the truth, or not the whole of it, and Alara sensed that even as he said it, but she was too exhausted, too raw from the events of the past hour, to press him for more. I do not have the means to repay you, Your Grace. I did not ask you to. Everyone asks eventually, Alara said, whether they say the words aloud or not. The Duke's mouth curved, not quite a smile, more the memory of one. You speak plainly for a woman who was, a quarter of an hour ago, about to be led out of this hall by a man with a very poor reputation. I have found that plain speaking is the only thing I still own outright, she said. Everything else has apparently been for sale. He studied her a moment longer, and something in his expression softened, as though her bitterness amused him less than it moved him. Then I shall not attempt to purchase your honesty as well, Miss Whitmore. You may keep that particular possession free of charge. Then what do you want from me? The question came out sharper than she intended, edged with the fear of a woman who had learned, over the last hard year, that kindness from powerful men rarely came without a price attached somewhere beneath the surface. The Duke's expression shifted, something almost like hurt passing over it before he smoothed it away. Nothing. You are not willing to give, he said. You will come to my household as a ward, under my protection, until such time as your circumstances are settled. You will have your own rooms, your own allowance, and no obligations beyond those of any guest in a respectable house. If, after a season, you wish to leave, you may do so, and I will not stop you. Alara studied him, searching his face for the lie she was certain must be hiding there. She found none, only that strange, persistent tiredness, and beneath it, something that looked almost like recognition, though she was certain they had never met. Why does that frighten you more than Thorn did? The Duke asked quietly, watching her. Because I do not understand it, she admitted. Cruelty, I understand. Kindness with no explanation is harder to trust. Something flickered across his face, gone before she could name it. A fair point, he said. Perhaps in time, I will find you a better explanation. A woman near the back of the hall, an older matron in dark green, leaned toward her companion and murmured something behind a gloved hand, her eyes fixed on Alara with open curiosity. Alara caught only fragments of it. The Duke, 5 years, never remarried, and felt a strange unease settle over her, though she could not have said what it meant or why it mattered. She was a stranger to this city's gossip, a stranger to its dukes and its lords and its long, tangled histories. She told herself the unease meant nothing at all. Outside, a carriage was already waiting, its doors marked with a crest she did not recognize, though again that strange, unplaceable familiarity stirred in her, like the ghost of a memory standing just beyond the reach of her mind. She climbed inside because the alternative was Thorn, and because something in the Duke's eyes had made her, against every instinct her hard year had taught her, want to believe him. As the carriage pulled away from the hall, Alara pressed her palm flat against the cool glass of the window and watched the city slide past, gray stone and grayer sky. She thought of the small locket hidden beneath her bodice, the one she never removed, the one with no portrait inside it, only a single word engraved on the inner surface, a word she had never been able to explain even to herself. Always. She did not know why she kept it. She did not remember where it had come from. The physician who had treated her after the accident 5 years ago had told her that some memories, once lost to fever and shock, simply did not return, and she had learned, slowly and painfully, to live around the hole in her own history, the way a tree grows around a buried stone. She did not see the Duke's hand tighten on the seat across from her, or the way his eyes had followed the small motion of her fingers against her collar, as though some part of him, some old and buried part, had recognized the gesture before his mind could catch up to it. He said nothing, neither did she. Alara turned her face back to the window, watching lamplighters move down the street with their long poles, coaxing small flames to life one after another against the coming dark. She thought, not for the first time, how strange it was that her life could turn so completely in the space of a single afternoon, from ruin to rescue, from a hall full of strangers bidding on her debts, to a carriage carrying her toward a house she had never seen, beside a man whose name she had not known that morning, and whose face now seemed, absurdly, impossibly, like something she had dreamed once and forgotten. She pressed her fingers briefly to the locket beneath her collar, feeling the small ridge of the engraved word through the fabric, and wondered, as she had wondered 1,000 times before, whose hand had once fastened it around her neck, and why some stubborn, wordless part of her still refused to take it off. The carriage rolled on through the darkening streets, carrying 2 strangers who were not strangers at all, toward a house that had stood empty of laughter for 5 long years, waiting, though neither of them yet understood it, for the day it would finally be full again. The house was too large and too quiet, and Alara could not decide which unsettled her more. She had been given a room on the 2nd floor, a soft blue chamber with tall windows overlooking a garden gone slightly wild in the autumn chill, and a wardrobe already stocked with dresses in her size, delivered the very morning after her arrival. She had not asked for them. She had not asked for the fire that was always lit before she woke, or the tray of chocolate that appeared at her door each morning without a knock, or the careful, deferential silence of every servant who passed her in the halls, as though they had all been instructed, in advance, to treat her not as a stranger but as someone returning. It was that last detail that troubled her most. On her first morning, she had woken disoriented, momentarily uncertain of where she was, and had reached instinctively for the left side of the bed before catching herself, embarrassed by the gesture, unable to explain why her hand had moved there at all. She sat up quickly, pressing her palm flat against the counterpane as though she could smooth away the strangeness of it, and told herself it was simply the disorientation of a new place, nothing more. But the feeling lingered through her washing and dressing, a faint, persistent wrongness, like a word sitting just at the edge of her tongue that she could not quite call forward. She spent that first day mostly alone, exploring the house with the careful, half-guilty curiosity of a guest who did not wish to overstep her welcome. The corridors were long and paneled in dark wood, hung with portraits of vain ancestors whose painted eyes seemed to follow her progress with quiet, unreadable judgment. At the end of one hallway, she found a door that had been shut and, she suspected, not opened in some time. Judging by the faint line of dust along its threshold, she did not try the handle. Something about its stillness felt deliberate, the way a wound is left untouched because touching it invites pain. "You've settled in well, I hope," the housekeeper said, a stout, kind-faced woman named Mrs. Abbott, who had taken to fussing over Alara with a warmth that felt oddly familiar, oddly rehearsed, as though she were performing a role she had once known by heart and was only now remembering the steps to. "Very well, thank you," Alara said, "though I confess I am curious. This room, it seems already arranged for a woman of my size, my preferences. I did not think His Grace kept guest chambers so thoroughly prepared." Something crossed Mrs. Abbott's face, quick and then gone, like a bird startled from a branch. "His Grace is a thoughtful man," she said, too carefully. "If you'll excuse me, miss, I've the linens to see to." She left before Alara could press further, and Alara stood alone in the blue room, turning slowly to study it again, the porcelain basin painted with small yellow birds, the hairbrush laid out on the vanity with its handle worn smooth in a way new brushes never were, the faint, ghost-thin scent of lavender that clung to the curtains as though it had lived there for years rather than days. She told herself it meant nothing. Grand houses were full of unused rooms, and perhaps this one had simply been the most convenient to prepare. She almost believed it. That afternoon, restless, she wandered down to the kitchens under the pretense of asking for tea, and found the younger servants far less guarded than Mrs. Abbott had been. A young maid named Bess, no older than 16 and not yet skilled in the art of careful silence, looked up from her work with wide, unguarded eyes. "Begging your pardon, miss, but you do look ever so like her," Bess said, before an older cook could shush her with a sharp look and a swat of a dish towel. "Like whom?" Alara asked, keeping her voice light, though her pulse had quickened. "Never you mind the girl," the cook said briskly. "She talks before she thinks, that one. Pay her no attention, miss." Bess ducked her head, chastened, but not before Alara caught the faint, apologetic shrug she gave, the look of a girl who knew she had said too much and did not entirely regret it. Alara left the kitchens with more questions than she had arrived with, and no closer to an answer than before. Dinner that evening was a quiet affair, just the Duke and herself at a table long enough to seat 20, the distance between them absurd, almost comic, if either of them had been inclined to laugh. Alara found she could not stop watching him, not out of any romantic interest, or so she told herself, but because there was something in the particular way he held his fork, the particular tilt of his head when he was thinking, that struck her as familiar in a way she could not place and could not shake. "You're staring, Miss Whitmore." She flushed. "Forgive me, I did not mean to. I did not say I minded." A faint smile touched his mouth, there and gone. "Only that I noticed. I keep thinking," she said slowly, "that I have met you before. Somewhere. I cannot place it, and it troubles me more than it ought to." The Duke went very still. For a moment, something raw passed behind his eyes, something that looked almost like hope, quickly and deliberately smothered, the way a man smothers a flame he has decided he cannot afford to let burn. London is full of familiar faces, he said finally, his voice carefully light. I dare say half the city looks like someone we once knew. It was not an answer, not really, and Alara heard the evasion in it as clearly as if he had spoken it aloud. But she did not push. She had learned, in the hard year since her father's death, that some doors were better left unopened, until one was certain what waited behind them. The days that followed fell into an easy rhythm despite the strangeness underlying them. The Duke was often occupied with estate business in the mornings, and Alara took to walking the gardens, then the small library, where she discovered, tucked behind a row of ordinary histories, a shelf of poetry with pages so worn and so often turned that certain lines had gone soft and pale from handling. She did not know why the sight of that shelf made her chest ache. She read them anyway, evening after evening, curled into the window seat with the lamp burning low, and found she already knew, before she reached the end of each stanza, exactly which words came next. One evening, the Duke found her there, curled into the window seat with a slim volume open on her knee, and stopped so abruptly in the doorway that she looked up in surprise. Your Grace? Is something wrong? No, he said, though his voice had gone rough. No, nothing is wrong. It is only that you are sitting exactly where she used to sit, in exactly that light. Alara's hand stilled on the page. Your wife. Yes. He crossed the room slowly, as though approaching something that might startle and vanish if he moved too quickly, and lowered himself into the chair opposite her. She loved that particular volume, wore the spine to ruin reading it, if I recall. I had thought I gave it away, or burned it, in one of the worst months after she was gone. I am glad, now, that I did not. What was she like? Alara asked softly, unable to stop herself, though some instinct told her the question walked dangerously close to a door neither of them was ready to open. The Duke was quiet for a long moment, his eyes distant, fixed on some point in the past that only he could see. Stubborn, he said finally, and something like a smile ghosted across his face. Quick-tempered, and quicker to forgive. She used to say that plain speaking was the only thing worth owning outright. Alara went very still. She had said almost those exact words to him, on the very first evening, in the auction hall, before either of them had known the other's name. She opened her mouth to say so, and found she could not, some deep and wordless fear closing her throat before the sentence could form. A strange coincidence, she managed instead. Yes, the Duke said, watching her with an intensity that made her heart beat too fast. Strange. He rose then, as though the moment had grown too heavy to sit inside any longer, and crossed to the window, his back to her, his shoulders held with the particular stiffness of a man holding something in by force of will alone. Forgive me, he said quietly. I did not mean to burden you with an old grief. It is not fair to you, and it is not fair to her memory, to keep speaking of her, as though she might still walk through that door. You need not apologize for missing your wife, Alara said gently. No, he agreed. But I begin to wonder if I am not missing her so much as searching for her in places she cannot possibly be found. In a stranger's voice, in the particular way a stranger sits by a window. He turned back to face her, and his eyes were dark with something that looked almost like fear. It is not fair to you, Miss Whitmore, to be looked at as though you might be someone you are not. Perhaps, Alara said slowly, you are not looking for her in me. Perhaps you are simply looking for peace, and have not yet found the shape it will take. He studied her for a long moment, and something in his face eased, though the shadow behind his eyes did not fully lift. You are, I think, wiser than you know. I am, I think, only tired, she said, and was relieved when it made him laugh, low and real, the first true laugh she had heard from him since her arrival. It was on the 7th evening that Lady Priscilla Vane, the Duke's cousin, arrived unannounced for supper, sweeping into the drawing room in a cloud of rose perfume and pointed curiosity. So this is the ward everyone has been whispering about, Lady Priscilla said, studying Alara with the frank, assessing look of a woman accustomed to cataloguing every rival in a room. Alaric, you might have warned me. I nearly dropped my teacup when Lady Ferris described her to me. She said the resemblance was uncanny, and I confess I thought she was exaggerating for effect, as she so often does. She was not exaggerating. Priscilla, the Duke said, a warning threaded through the single word. I am only stating what half of London is already saying, cousin, whether you wish to hear it or not. Priscilla turned back to Alara, her sharp eyes softening slightly, curious rather than cruel. Forgive me, Miss Whitmore. It is only that you bear a remarkable likeness to someone this family lost some years ago. It gave me quite a turn. Lost? Alara asked, before she could stop herself. Priscilla, that is enough, the Duke said, and there was steel in it now. Enough that his cousin's mouth snapped shut, though her eyes remained bright with unspoken questions. He turned to Alara, and for a moment his composure faltered entirely, something raw and unguarded flickering across his face before he mastered it. It is a family matter, a private grief. I would rather not discuss it at supper. Alara nodded, though the words lost in grief and the way his voice had cracked ever so slightly around them, followed her up the stairs that night, and sat with her, long after the candle had burned down to nothing. She thought of Lady Priscilla's sharp eyes, and the way they had softened when she said uncanny, and the way the Duke's composure had cracked, briefly, entirely, before he caught himself and rebuilt it stone by careful stone. She thought of Bess in the kitchens, and the cook's swift, practiced silence, the silence of a household well-trained in not speaking of a grief too large for words. Everywhere she turned in this house, she found the same shape pressed into the air, the outline of a woman gone but not forgotten, a woman whose absence had rearranged every room and every routine around the space she once occupied. She did not sleep well. In her dreams, fragmented and formless as they had been for 5 years, she heard a voice she could not place saying her name, only not her name, a different name, softer, older, spoken with a tenderness that made her wake with tears already dried on her face, and no memory of why she had wept. The next afternoon she found the Duke in the small study off the library, standing before the cold hearth with a portrait in his hands, one he quickly turned face down at the sound of her step, though not quickly enough, she had seen it. A woman with dark hair and a familiar tilt to her chin, painted with a tenderness that suggested the artist had loved his subject as much as rendered her. "Your Grace," she said carefully. Who was she? He did not turn around immediately. When he did, his eyes were shadowed with something she could not name. Grief, perhaps, or its close cousin, guilt. "My wife," he said quietly. "She died 5 years ago. A carriage accident, on the road from Bath. They never recovered her body from the river." The words landed in Alara's chest like stones dropped into still water, sending out ripples she did not understand. 5 years, a carriage accident, a river. She felt suddenly, inexplicably cold, though the fire in the study burned steady and warm. "I am sorry," she managed. "That is a terrible loss." "Yes," the Duke said, his gaze fixed on her face with an intensity that made her want to look away, and made it impossible to do so. It was. Neither of them spoke of it again that day, but something had shifted between them, some fragile, unnamed thing drawing tighter with every hour. Later, alone in her room, Alara found herself standing before the tall mirror in the corner, studying her own reflection as though it belonged to a stranger. She tried to imagine her hair darker, her face fuller, the way it might have looked 5 years ago, before hardship carved its quiet lines into her features. She tried to imagine a portrait of herself hanging somewhere in this house, turned face down in a drawer, waiting to be recognized. It was a foolish thought. She told herself so, twice, firmly, and did not believe herself either time. That night, Alara sat before her mirror with the locket open in her palm, staring at the single engraved word until the letters blurred and swam, and did not understand, not yet, why her hands would not stop shaking. Lord Thorne's carriage stopped outside a narrow office on Chancery Lane 3 days later, and the man who stepped out of it wore the calm, satisfied expression of someone who has just found the one thread that, pulled correctly, will unravel an entire garment. "You are certain of the clause," Thorne said to the small, nervous solicitor waiting inside. "Quite certain, my lord." The solicitor slid a folded document across the desk, his hands trembling slightly, though whether from cold or fear was difficult to say. The original debt agreement, drafted by the girl's father some years before his death, contains a reversion clause. Should the debt be settled by any party other than the girl herself, and should that debt later be found to have been fraudulently understated at the time of transfer, the settlement may be challenged, and the original creditor's claim reinstated. Thorne smiled, slow and thin. "And was the debt understated?" "There is room to argue it, my lord, with the right figures, the right witnesses." "Then find me the right figures, and the right witnesses." Thorne rose, straightening his gloves with the same unhurried precision he had shown in the auction hall. "The Duke of Ashgrove made a fool of me in front of half of London. I intend to remind him, and everyone watching, exactly what happens to men who forget their place." He left the solicitor's office without another word, already composing, in the quiet architecture of his mind, the shape of his revenge. He stopped, on his way back to his own residence, at a small tavern near the river where a man he trusted for less official errands was already waiting. nursing a tankard of ale with the patience of someone paid well to be patient. "You have found nothing more on her past," Thorne said, sliding into the seat opposite without greeting. "Little enough, my lord. The family kept poor records, and much was lost in the fire that took her father's study 2 years back. I did find one curious thing, though." The man leaned forward, lowering his voice. "A physician near Bath, retired now, who once treated a woman, pulled from the river after a carriage accident. Unnamed woman, no papers, no memory of her own name. He kept her in his care near a year before she was well enough to leave on her own account." Thorne's eyes narrowed with sudden, sharpened interest. "When was this?" "5 years past, my lord. Nearly to the season." "And the timing?" Thorne said slowly, a thought unfurling behind his eyes like smoke. "Aligns rather neatly with the Duke's own loss, does it not?" "It would seem so, my lord, though I could not say for certain it is the same woman." "No," Thorne agreed, and his smile returned, colder and more considering than before. "But certainty is not always necessary, only usefulness. Keep digging. If there is a connection to be found, I intend to be the one who finds it first, and I intend to decide exactly when, and how, it becomes known." At the Ashgrove estate, Ilara knew nothing yet of the storm gathering on Chancery Lane, though a different kind of tension had begun to build within the house itself, quieter, but no less consuming. It began with an invitation. "The Whitfield ball," the Duke said one morning at breakfast, sliding the cream-colored card across the table toward her. "Lady Whitfield hosts it every autumn. I had thought to decline, as I have most years, but I find myself reconsidering." "Why reconsider now?" Ilara asked, though something in her chest had already begun to flutter with an anticipation she did not entirely trust. "Because Priscilla informs me that half the city is already speculating about you, and speculation left untended tends to grow teeth. Better, perhaps, that they see you plainly, on my arm, as my ward, than that they invent worse stories in the dark. And what if my presence only feeds the speculation you wish to end? Then we shall face that together." He looked at her then, steady and direct, and something in his gaze made the flutter in her chest deepen into something warmer, something she did not have a name for and was afraid to search for one. "I would rather stand beside you and be seen than hide you away and be whispered about. You deserve better than whispers, Miss Whitmore." She agreed, against her better judgment, or perhaps precisely because her better judgment had grown quieter with every day she spent in this house, every evening spent reading poetry she somehow already knew, every quiet meal shared across too long a table that no longer felt quite so long. In the days before the ball, she found herself watching him more closely than she had allowed herself to before, cataloging small things without quite meaning to. The way he paused, mid-sentence, whenever a particular perfume drifted past, as though searching the air for something it did not contain. The way his eyes sometimes rested on her hands, on the small, unconscious gestures she made while she spoke, with an attention that felt less like courtship and more like a man trying to solve an equation he had long ago given up as unsolvable. She caught him once, in the corridor outside the locked room she had noticed on her first day, standing very still before the door with his palm flat against the wood, his head bowed, as though listening for something on the other side. He did not hear her approach until she was nearly beside him, and when he turned, the grief on his face was so raw, so entirely unguarded, that she felt it in her own chest like a physical ache. "Forgive me," he said, straightening quickly. "I did not mean for you to see that." "You do not have to hide your grief from me, Your Grace." "It is not only grief," he admitted, after a long pause, his eyes returning to the shut door. "It is guilt, as much as sorrow. I was not there, the night of the accident. I had stayed behind for business I have long since forgotten the importance of, and let her travel that road without me, and I have spent 5 years wondering whether my presence might have changed what happened, whether she called for me, at the end, and I was not there to answer." "You could not have known," Ilara said softly. "No," he agreed, "but knowing that does not make the guilt lighter, it only makes it quieter, and quiet guilt has a way of settling into a man's bones, and staying there, long after the reasons for it have faded." She wanted to reach for his hand, and did not, uncertain of what such a gesture would mean, or invite, or promise. Instead, she simply stood beside him a moment longer, in the hush of that shut and grieving corridor, and let her presence be whatever small comfort it could. The ball itself was a glittering, overwhelming affair, candlelight multiplied 1,000 times over in mirrors and crystal, the air thick with perfume and the particular electric hum of a room full of people watching each other watch each other. Ilara wore a gown of deep green, chosen for her by a modiste the Duke had quietly engaged, And when she descended the staircase to meet him at its foot, she saw something in his face still and catch, unguarded for just a moment before he mastered it. "You look," he said softly, offering his arm, "like someone I have been trying very hard not to remember. Is that a compliment, Your Grace?" "I have not yet decided," he admitted, "whether it terrifies me or not." They moved through the ball together, and for a while, the evening was almost pleasant, almost easy, the Duke's hand steady at the small of her back as he guided her through introductions to lords and ladies whose names she promptly forgot, too absorbed in the strange, warm feeling of being seen, truly seen, for the first time since the auction hall. Then Lord Thorne arrived. He did not approach immediately. He circled the edges of the ballroom first, exchanging pleasantries with acquaintances, accepting a glass of wine, allowing the tension to build slowly, deliberately, the way a hunter allows his prey to grow comfortable, before closing the distance. Alara felt him before she saw him, a prickling awareness at the back of her neck, and when she turned, his eyes were already fixed on her from across the room, cold and patient and utterly certain. "Do not let him see that he frightens you," the Duke murmured, his hand tightening almost imperceptibly at her waist. "Men like Thorne feed on fear, starve him of it." She lifted her chin and did her best. Thorne crossed the room at last, bowing with exaggerated courtesy to the Duke before turning his attention fully to Alara. "Miss Whitmore, you are looking remarkably well, for a woman so recently rescued from ruin." "I am looking well because I am well, my lord," Alara said. "I trust you are recovering from your disappointment." A flicker of genuine anger crossed Thorne's face before he smoothed it away. "You have a sharp tongue for a woman who owes her current comfort entirely to another man's charity." "She owes nothing," the Duke said, his voice low and even, though the warning beneath it was unmistakable. "The debt was settled in full. There is no further business between you." "Is there not?" Thorne's smile widened, thin and cold. "I wonder if Miss Whitmore is aware that debts settled under certain conditions may in some circumstances be reopened. I would hate for her comfort to prove as temporary as her father's fortune." The words landed like a slap, and Alara felt the warmth of the evening drain away all at once, replaced by the same cold dread she had felt in the auction hall, the sense of ground shifting beneath her feet without warning. "You are threatening the lady," the Duke said, his voice dropping dangerously quiet, "in a public ballroom, in front of witnesses." "I am merely making conversation, Your Grace. Surely that is not forbidden, even to men you have chosen to embarrass." "Leave," the Duke said. "Now, before I forget that we are in Lady Whitfield's home, and not somewhere I might speak to you as you truly deserve." For a moment the two men stared at each other, the air between them taut enough to snap, and Alara held her breath, acutely aware of the eyes now turning toward them from every corner of the ballroom. Then Thorne inclined his head, mockingly polite, and withdrew, melting back into the crowd with the same unhurried calm with which he had arrived. "I am sorry," the Duke said quietly, once Thorne was out of earshot. "I should not have brought you here. I underestimated how far he might go to save his pride." "You did not know," Alara said, though her hands were still trembling faintly at her sides. "None of us knew." "What did he mean?" she asked, quieter still. "About debts being reopened." The Duke's jaw tightened. "I do not know precisely, but I intend to find out before he has the chance to act on whatever scheme he is constructing. Whatever it is, Alara, I will not let it touch you." It was the first time he had used her given name, and something in the sound of it, spoken low and fierce in the middle of a crowded ballroom, undid something in her chest that she had been holding carefully closed since the moment she first saw him. They left the ball earlier than planned, the Duke's mood darkened by the confrontation, and the carriage ride home passed mostly in silence, though it was not an uncomfortable one. Alara found herself watching his profile in the dim light, the tight set of his jaw, the restless way his hands moved as though searching for something to hold, to fix, to protect. "May I ask you something?" she said finally, as the carriage turned onto the long drive leading toward the house. "Anything. Why does it matter so much to you? My safety, my comfort. You barely knew me a fortnight ago, and yet you speak of protecting me as though I were something precious you had already lost once and could not bear to lose again." The Duke went very still, and for a long moment he did not answer, his eyes fixed on some point beyond the window, beyond the dark hedgerows sliding past. "I do not have a good answer for you," he said finally. "Only that from the moment I saw you in that auction hall, something in me recognized something in you, though I could not, and still cannot, explain what or why. I have told myself a dozen times that it is foolishness. Grief, perhaps, dressing itself up as recognition, the mind reaching for a comfort it cannot have. And yet, And yet the feeling does not fade, he said quietly. If anything, it grows stronger every day you remain in that house. I do not know what to make of that, Alara. I am not certain I am ready to know. She wanted in that moment to tell him everything, the locket, the word, always engraved inside it, the dreams that woke her with tears already dried on her face, and a name half formed on her lips that was not quite her own. She opened her mouth, and the words gathered at the back of her throat, and then, just as quickly, fear closed around them and pulled them back down. What if she told him, and she was wrong? What if the locket meant nothing, was simply a trinket bought second-hand, a fragment of some other woman's forgotten life, and she made a fool of them both, chasing a ghost that did not belong to her? Nothing, she said instead. It is nothing, only tiredness, and too strange an evening. The Duke studied her for a moment longer, as though he sensed there was more beneath her words, but he did not press. He simply reached across the small space between them and took her hand, holding it gently, wordlessly, for the remainder of the ride, and Alara let him, because some quiet, certain part of her had already stopped fighting the truth her mind had not yet allowed her to speak. Back in her room that night, Alara could not sleep. She lay awake long after the candle had guttered out, listening to the old house settle around her, the familiar creak of timber cooling, the distant call of some night bird beyond the garden wall. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Thorne's cold, satisfied smile, and heard again the low threat beneath his words. Debts settled under certain conditions may, in some circumstances, be reopened, and felt the same helpless dread she had carried out of the auction hall a fortnight before, the dread of a woman whose fate was, once again, being decided by men in rooms she could not enter. She rose eventually and crossed to the window, drawing back the curtain to look out over the moonlit garden below. A light still burned in one of the ground-floor windows, and after a moment's hesitation, she pulled a shawl around her shoulders and made her way downstairs, drawn by something she could not quite name. She found the Duke in his study, exactly as she expected, seated behind his desk with a stack of correspondence untouched before him, staring instead into the dying fire with the particular stillness of a man too troubled to sleep and too restless to work. "You should be resting," he said without turning, though he must have heard her approach. "So should you." A faint, tired smile touched his mouth. "I find sleep has grown difficult since Thorne's little performance tonight. I keep turning the conversation over, searching for what he meant, and finding nothing but more questions. May I sit with you a while?" she asked. "I find I do not wish to be alone with my own thoughts tonight either." He gestured to the chair opposite, and she settled into it, drawing her knees up beneath her shawl in a posture that felt, absurdly, like something she had done 100 times before in this very room, in this very chair, though she knew that could not be true. They did not speak of Thorne again that night. Instead, the Duke told her, slowly and almost reluctantly at first, small fragments of his own life, his childhood in this house, a mother who had died when he was young, a father who had taught him duty before he had ever taught him warmth. Alara listened, and found herself, without quite deciding to, offering fragments of her own life in return, the parts she remembered clearly, at least, the years after the accident, the slow rebuilding of a life from almost nothing. "It must have been frightening," the Duke said quietly, "waking with so much of yourself missing." "It still is some days," she admitted. "I have learned to live around the gaps, but I have never stopped wishing I could fill them." "Perhaps," he said, watching her with that same searching intensity she had come to know so well, "you will not have to keep wishing forever." Neither of them said more than that, but the words settled between them like a promise neither was yet ready to name aloud, and when Alara finally returned to her room, well past midnight, she slept more soundly than she had in years, though she could not have said why. Somewhere behind them, in a house of his own, Lord Thorne sat before a fire with the solicitor's documents spread across his desk, a glass of brandy at his elbow, and a smile on his face that promised nothing good for anyone who stood in his way. The summons arrived on a gray Tuesday morning, delivered by a clerk in ink-stained gloves, who would not meet Alara's eyes as he pressed the folded paper into the Duke's hands. "A formal notice," the Duke said, reading it once, then again, his expression darkening with each line. "Thorne has filed a claim through the courts. He alleges the original debt agreement was fraudulently understated, and that the settlement I made in that auction hall is therefore void. He is demanding a hearing, and demanding that Alara appear before it." "Can he do that?" Alara asked, her voice tighter than she intended. "He can attempt it. Whether he can succeed is another matter entirely." The Duke set the paper down with exaggerated care, as though handling it roughly might somehow give the threat more power than it already possessed. I have already sent word to my own solicitor. We will not go into that courtroom unprepared. But preparation, Ilara soon learned, did little to blunt the particular cruelty of what followed. Word of the claim spread through London with astonishing speed, and within days, the whispers that had followed her since the ball sharpened into something crueler, more pointed. She could feel it in the way certain acquaintances of the Duke's now looked at her when they thought she did not notice, a mixture of pity and suspicion, as though she might, after all, be exactly the sort of woman capable of defrauding a grieving man out of his fortune and his affections both. At the milliner's shop, where she had gone one afternoon simply to escape the closeness of the house, she overheard two women discussing her in low, unguarded voices, unaware or uncaring that she stood close enough to hear every word. They say she appeared from nowhere, with no family to speak for her, one murmured. And now suddenly there is a legal claim against the very debt that brought her into his household. One does wonder. One does indeed, the other agreed. A duke is a fine prize for a clever woman with nothing left to lose. Ilara left without purchasing anything, her cheeks burning, her hands clenched tight at her sides to keep them from trembling. She did not tell the duke what she had heard. She told herself it did not matter, that strangers' opinions could not touch the truth of what she knew in her own heart, and yet the words followed her home regardless, settling into some tender, unhealed part of her that Thorn's cruelty had never quite managed to reach before. "Ignore them," Lady Priscilla said firmly, arriving one afternoon with a determined set to her jaw, and a stack of correspondence she had apparently been intercepting on Ilara's behalf. Small minds require small scandals to feed on. It will pass, once the hearing proves Thorn a liar, which it will. And if it does not, Ilara asked quietly, what if he finds some way to make it true, even where it is not? Priscilla's expression softened, some of her briskness falling away. Then Alaric will fight it with everything he has, and so, I suspect, will you. I have watched my cousin mourn for 5 years, Miss Whitmore. I have never once, in all that time, seen him fight for anything the way he has fought for you these past weeks. Whatever Thorn intends, he will find it is not so easily done. The hearing was set for a fortnight hence, and in the days leading up to it, the household settled into a tense, watchful rhythm, every conversation shadowed by the looming date, every silence weighted with things unsaid. Ilara found herself unable to concentrate on her books, her walks, the small, quiet pleasures that had begun, slowly, to make this strange house feel almost like home. Instead, she paced, and worried, and lay awake counting the days. The Duke, for his part, spent long hours closeted with his solicitor, a sharp-eyed, methodical man named Mr. Ellison, who arrived each morning with a fresh satchel of documents and left each evening looking marginally more confident than the day before. Ilara was permitted to sit in on some of these meetings, though she understood perhaps half of the legal language exchanged across the desk, and found herself instead studying the Duke, the tight control he kept over his temper whenever Thorn's name arose, the restless energy that seemed to have no proper outlet beyond endless preparation. "You do not have to protect me from every unpleasant detail," she told him one evening, after Mr. Ellison had departed and the Duke had fallen into a brooding silence over his brandy. "I am not so fragile as that, whatever Thorn believes." "I know you are not fragile," he said. "I have watched you stand your ground against a man who terrifies grown lords into silence. It is not your fragility I fear protecting you from. It is my own helplessness. I bought your freedom once already, Ilara, and I could not save you from what came after that purchase. I do not intend to fail you twice." "You have not failed me," she said softly. "Not once, not in any way that matters." He looked at her then, with an expression she could not quite name, something caught between gratitude and a grief so old it had become almost a permanent fixture behind his eyes, and she wondered, not for the first time, what exactly he was grieving so fiercely for, a woman he had known such a comparatively short while. It was during one such sleepless night that she finally found the courage to search the locked room at the end of the hallway. She told herself, afterward, that she had not planned it, that she had simply wandered too far in her restlessness, and found the door, for once, standing very slightly ajar, as though someone had forgotten, in haste, to secure it properly. She told herself many things. None of them changed the fact that her hand was already on the door before her mind had finished deciding whether she ought to open it. The room beyond was smaller than she expected, and unmistakably a woman's chamber, though one long undisturbed. Dust lay thick over most surfaces, but here and there, small signs of careful recent tending remained. A vase of dried flowers replaced more than once, a coverlet smoothed rather than left to gather grime. On the dressing table sat a hairbrush, and a small collection of hairpins, and beside them, in a simple wooden box, a stack of letters tied with faded ribbon. Elara knew she should not touch them. She untied the ribbon anyway, her hands trembling, and unfolded the topmost letter, written in a hand she recognized instantly and impossibly as her own, though she had no memory of writing it. "My dearest Alaric," it began, "I know we have agreed to keep our marriage secret until your father's business in the north is settled, but I confess the waiting grows harder with each day we spend pretending to be strangers in our own drawing rooms." The letter fell from her fingers. She heard, distantly, footsteps in the corridor behind her, quick and urgent, and turned to find the Duke standing in the doorway, his face white with a shock so total it seemed to have stripped away every careful composure he had built over 5 long years. "Elara," he said, and his voice broke entirely on her name, though it was not, she understood now with a cold and total certainty, the name he had meant to say. "I do not understand," she whispered, though some deep and buried part of her already did, had perhaps always understood, in the wordless language of dreams and instinct and a locket she could never bring herself to remove. "This letter, it is my hand. I know it is my hand, though I cannot remember writing it." The Duke crossed the room slowly, as though the ground beneath him had become suddenly, dangerously uncertain, and knelt before her, taking her trembling hands in both of his. "Elara," he said again, softer this time, and this time she understood, with a jolt that stole the breath from her lungs entirely, that it was not a mistake at all. "That is my name," she said, "not Whitmore. Elara, you called me that from the very first night, and I never thought to ask why it felt so natural on your tongue." "Because it is your name," the Duke said, his eyes bright with tears he did not bother to hide. "Elara Vane, my wife. I have been searching for the ghost of you in a stranger's face for 5 years, and God forgive me, I let myself believe it was only grief playing tricks, because the alternative was too impossible to hope for." The room seemed to tilt around her, memory and disbelief colliding in her chest with such force she could barely draw breath. "The accident," she managed. "The river. I remember cold water, and darkness, and a voice calling a name I could never quite place when I woke in a stranger's house months later with no memory of my own." "You were thrown from the carriage," the Duke said, his voice thick with old grief, finally finding its way toward relief. "They searched the river for days and found nothing, and I was told, by men I trusted, that there was no hope left to search for. I buried an empty coffin, Elara. I have spent 5 years visiting a grave with nothing in it, and all that time, you were alive and lost, and so close I could have found you if only I had known where to look." Elara pressed her hand to her mouth, unable to speak past the tightness in her throat, memories beginning to surface now in fractured, painful pieces. A wedding conducted quietly in a small chapel, a promise made in secret while his father's approval was still being sought, a locket clasped around her neck the morning after their vows with a single word engraved inside it. "Always. You gave me this," she whispered, her fingers finding the locket beneath her collar. "The night we were married." "I did," the Duke said. "I told you it was the only word large enough to hold what I felt for you, and too small besides." She did not know which of them moved first, only that a moment later she was in his arms, weeping into his shoulder while he held her as though he intended never again to let 5 years, or an ocean, or the whole of London's cruel gossip come between them. It was not a gentle reunion, not entirely. Grief and joy and 5 long years of separate mourning tangled too tightly together to be pulled apart cleanly. But it was, at last, a true one. "I have so many questions," she said at last, drawing back enough to look at his face, memorizing it now with new and hungry eyes, searching for the husband beneath the grieving stranger she had spent weeks learning to trust. "How did we meet? How did you propose? What manner of woman was I, before the accident took half of myself away?" "You were impossible," the Duke said, a wet laugh breaking through his tears. "Impossible, and clever, and utterly unwilling to be told what a duchess ought or ought not do. We met at a garden party neither of us wished to attend, both of us hiding from our respective families near the same hedge, and you told me, within the first quarter hour of our acquaintance, that my cravat was tied badly, and that you intended to fix it whether I permitted it or not." Elara laughed despite herself, despite the tears still wet on her cheeks, because something in the story rang true in a way she could not explain, a familiar warmth uncurling in her chest, as though her own body remembered even where her mind had forgotten. "We married within the year," the Duke continued, "in secret, because my father had already arranged a match he considered more advantageous, and we were both too stubborn and too in love to wait for his approval, or defy him openly before we were ready. We meant to tell him after his business in the north concluded. We never had the chance. And after the accident, Alara said slowly, your father's match. Did you ever? No, the Duke said firmly, before she could finish the question. I refused every match presented to me for 5 years, to my father's considerable frustration, because some part of me, even believing you did, could not bring myself to stand before an altar with anyone else. I told myself it was grief. Perhaps it was also, without my knowing it, hope. Thorn, Alara said suddenly, pulling back, her mind snapping into sharp, urgent focus. The hearing, if this is known, if he learns the truth before we are ready to use it, then we will make certain he does not learn it a moment before it can destroy him utterly, the Duke said, his jaw setting with new and formidable purpose. You are my wife, Alara, my Duchess. No court in this kingdom will hand you to Cassius Thorn while I still draw breath to stop it. They sat together long into the night, the letters spread carefully between them, piecing together fragments of a life Alara could not remember but felt, with every word she read, settling back into place inside her like a bone long broken finally set straight. The Duke told her small things, the color she had once favored for her morning dresses, a particular laugh she used to give when she thought a joke unworthy of full amusement but could not help herself regardless. And with each detail, something in Alara's chest grew warmer, steadier, as though she were being handed back, piece by careful piece, the very self she had spent 5 long years mourning without even knowing its name. We will need to be careful, the Duke said eventually, reluctantly returning his thoughts to the hearing still looming ahead of them. Thorn cannot be permitted to learn of this before we choose the moment ourselves. If he suspects the truth before we are prepared to reveal it publicly, on our own terms, he may find some way to twist it against us regardless. Then we will be careful, Alara agreed, though a new and steady courage had settled into her voice, the courage of a woman who finally understood exactly who she was, and exactly what she stood to defend. Outside, unseen by either of them, a shadow moved briefly past the garden wall and withdrew into the dark, having seen, through a gap in the curtains, rather more of that private reunion than either occupant of the room would ever have wished. Lord Thorn read the note from his hired watcher twice before he allowed himself to smile. A private embrace, the man had written, describing what he had glimpsed through the gap in the curtains that night. Tears, an embrace that lasted long past midnight. A locked room, opened for the first time in years. It was not proof of anything, not precisely, but Thorn had built his fortune on knowing exactly how much certainty a man required before he could bend a rumor into a weapon. He summoned Mr. Ellison's clerk, a young man with expensive tastes and insufficient wages, the following morning, and pressed a folded note of considerable value into his palm in exchange for a single piece of information, whether the Duke of Ashgrove's solicitor had, in recent days, filed any document referencing the identity or history of one Alara Whitmore. The clerk, after a moment's hesitation and a longer look at the note in his hand, confirmed that he had. Thorn's smile widened. He did not yet know the whole of it, but he knew enough to be dangerous, and a dangerous man with half a truth was, in his considerable experience, often more destructive than one with the whole of it, because half a truth left room for exactly the kind of public spectacle he intended to make. The hearing was 3 days away. He intended to arrive prepared for a battle no one else in that courtroom would see coming, until it was already too late to stop. At the Ashgrove estate, the days following Alara's discovery passed in a strange, suspended blend of joy and dread, each hour bringing fresh fragments of memory surfacing unbidden, a favorite song half remembered. The particular ache of missing a mother she now recalled had died when Alara herself was still a girl, the name of a childhood dog that arrived in her mind with startling, tearful clarity one otherwise ordinary afternoon. It is like watching a house being rebuilt from the inside, the Duke told Priscilla, who had been let into the secret under strict conditions of silence, her earlier suspicions finally, gloriously confirmed. Room by room, wall by wall. I do not know how long it will take before every corner is furnished again, but I have never been more grateful to watch anything happen so slowly. You will need to move faster than slowly, cousin, where Thorn is concerned, Priscilla warned, her earlier delight tempering into practical concern. If he learns even a fragment of this before you are ready to present it yourselves, he will find some way to make the truth look like a lie constructed for the courtroom's benefit. You must control when and how this is revealed. It was sound advice, and the Duke and Alara spent long hours with Mr. Ellison constructing exactly such a plan, gathering the physical proof of the marriage, the church register in the small chapel where they had wed, the letters in Alara's own hand, the testimony of the elderly clergyman who had performed the ceremony and who, upon being visited and gently reminded of the occasion, wept openly at the news that the bride he had long believed drowned was in fact alive and seated before him. "We will present it at the hearing itself," Mr. Ellison advised, "before Thorne's counsel can raise their fraudulent debt claim. If the court establishes first that Miss Whitmore is in fact the Duchess of Ashgrove, married lawfully 5 years past, then Thorne's entire argument collapses before it can properly begin. A debt allegedly owed by Alara Whitmore becomes irrelevant the moment the court recognizes there is no such person separate from the Duchess herself." "And if he has already discovered the truth by then?" Alara asked. "If he finds some way to strike first?" "Then we adapt," the Duke said grimly, "but we will not go into that room unprepared, whatever he attempts." The morning of the hearing arrived gray and cold, London's sky heavy with clouds that seemed, to Alara, entirely appropriate to the weight settled in her own chest. She dressed carefully, in deep blue rather than the somber colors she might once have chosen, at the Duke's quiet insistence. "You are not walking into that room as a woman accused," he told her, fastening the clasp of a necklace at her throat, replacing, for this day only, the small locket she had worn every day since long before either of them understood why. "You are walking in as my Duchess, returned from the dead, and I intend for every soul in that courtroom to understand it the moment you enter." The courtroom itself was smaller than Alara expected, though no less imposing for its size, dark-paneled walls and hard benches filling quickly with spectators drawn by weeks of simmering gossip. She saw Priscilla seated near the front, her expression fixed and determined, and beside her, unexpectedly, the elderly clergyman who had married them, his hands folded tightly over a small leather-bound register. Lord Thorne arrived precisely on time, immaculately dressed, his expression carrying the particular satisfied calm of a man who believes he has already won. "Your Grace, Miss Whitmore." He inclined his head with mocking courtesy as he passed their table. "I trust you are both prepared for a rather illuminating morning." "As are you, I imagine," the Duke said evenly, "though perhaps not in the manner you anticipate." Thorne's smile flickered, just slightly, before he continued to his own seat, and Alara felt a small, fierce satisfaction at having unsettled him even that much. The proceedings opened with the usual formalities. The magistrate, a stern, elderly man named Justice Colby, who seemed entirely unmoved by the crowded benches or the evident scandal simmering beneath the room's surface. Thorne's counsel rose first, laying out the claim with practiced precision, alleging fraud in the original debt settlement, demanding the reinstatement of Lord Thorne's rightful claim over the person and obligations of one Alara Whitmore. "Before counsel proceeds further," Mr. Ellison interjected, rising smoothly to his feet, "I would ask the court's indulgence to address a matter of fundamental relevance to this entire proceeding, namely, the true identity of the woman named in Lord Thorne's claim." Justice Colby's brows rose slightly. "Proceed, Counselor." "The claim before this court alleges fraud against a woman named Alara Whitmore," Mr. Ellison said. "I submit to the court that no such woman, as a legal entity separate and distinct from another, has existed for the past 5 years. I submit that the woman known to this household, to Lord Thorne, and to London society as Alara Whitmore is, in fact, Alara Vane, Duchess of Ashgrove, lawfully married to the Duke 5 years past, and presumed dead following a carriage accident from which she was in fact merely lost, suffering a complete loss of memory that persisted until recent weeks." The courtroom erupted into a low, urgent murmur, quickly silenced by the magistrate's sharp gavel. Thorne rose halfway from his seat, his composure cracking for the first time that morning. "This is absurd, a convenient fiction, constructed to escape a legitimate claim." "A fiction supported," Mr. Ellison continued calmly, gesturing toward the elderly clergyman now rising from his seat with the church register clutched carefully in both hands, "by the marriage register of St. Aldrich's Chapel, recording the marriage of Alaric Vane, Duke of Ashgrove, and Alara Grantham, 5 years past, and by the sworn testimony of the officiating clergyman present in this very room, who is prepared to confirm both the marriage and the identity of the bride now seated before this court." The clergyman was called forward, and confirmed, in a voice trembling with emotion, every detail Mr. Ellison had presented, describing the quiet, secret ceremony, the joy on both young faces, his own shock and grief upon learning of the bride's presumed death, and his overwhelming relief, mere days past, at learning she yet lived. Thorne's counsel attempted, briefly and increasingly desperately, to challenge the register's authenticity, to suggest the clergyman's memory had been coached or purchased, But Justice Colby's patience for such objections thinned visibly with each attempt. And when the physician who had originally treated the unnamed, memory-lost woman pulled from the river near Bath was produced to confirm the timeline beyond any reasonable doubt, the courtroom's mood shifted entirely, sympathy and fascination replacing the earlier appetite for scandal. "Lord Thorne," Justice Colby said finally, his voice heavy with unmistakable disapproval, "it appears the woman you sought to reclaim under a fraudulent debt claim is, in fact, a duchess of this realm, wrongfully believed dead, and entirely beyond any claim you might once have imagined yourself entitled to pursue. I am inclined to view your original conduct in this matter, the manner in which you acquired her father's debts and attempted to compel her into your household, with considerable suspicion. I will be ordering a full review of your financial dealings in this and, I understand, several similar cases." Thorne's face had gone the color of ash. He rose stiffly, some last vestige of pride keeping his spine straight even as his entire scheme collapsed around him in full view of the city he had once terrorized so freely. "This is not finished," he said, low and venomous, though the words carried none of their earlier power. "I believe, my lord," the Duke said, rising to stand beside Alara, his hand finding hers with quiet, unshakable certainty, "that it is finished entirely. You may go." Thorne left the courtroom without another word, his footsteps echoing hollow against the same marble that had once carried him triumphantly out of the auction hall, though this time no one watching mistook the sound for anything but retreat. The celebration that followed, brief and quiet though it was, felt to Alara like the first true breath she had drawn since the auction hall's gavel had fallen weeks before. Priscilla embraced her fiercely outside the courthouse steps, tears standing openly in her sharp eyes, and the elderly clergyman took both her hands in his own trembling ones, murmuring blessings she only half heard over the ringing relief in her ears. "It is over," she said to the Duke, as their carriage pulled away from the courthouse at last, London's grey sky somehow brighter than it had seemed that morning. "It is truly over." "Nearly," he said, though he did not look entirely at ease, his eyes still fixed on the courthouse steps behind them, where Thorne's carriage had not yet departed. "A man like Thorne does not surrender easily, Alara, even when the law itself has turned against him. I would rather we remain cautious a little longer, until I am certain he has accepted defeat rather than merely retreated to consider his next move." His caution proved well-founded. That same evening, while the household still glowed with the quiet relief of the day's victory, a note arrived by unmarked messenger, delivered to the kitchen door rather than the front, addressed to Alara alone in handwriting she recognized immediately from the letters Thorne's solicitor had once sent regarding her father's debts. She did not wish to open it. She did so anyway, some old hard-won instinct insisting she face whatever threat it carried directly rather than allow it to fester unread. "You may have won your name back in a courtroom," the note read, in Thorne's own precise, cold hand, "but names are not the only things a man can lose. I have spent a great deal of money and no small amount of patience on you, Duchess, and I do not intend to walk away from this matter entirely empty-handed. Consider this a final courtesy. I will be in touch regarding the manner of your repayment, and I promise you, it will not involve another courtroom." Ilara's hands had gone cold by the time she finished reading, and she carried the note directly to the Duke's study, where he read it twice in grim, gathering silence before setting it down with deliberate care. "He means to act outside the law now," the Duke said quietly, "since the law has failed him. What do? We do not wait to find out what he intends," the Duke said, already rising, already reaching for the bell to summon his household staff. "I will double the watch on the house tonight, and send word to the magistrate regarding this threat directly. Whatever Thorne is planning, Alara, I do not intend to give him the opportunity to attempt it unchallenged." The watch was set within the hour, footmen and grooms alike stationed quietly at every entrance to the estate, lanterns burning steady against the deepening dark. Alara sat with the Duke in his study long past midnight, neither of them willing to retire while the threat in Thorne's note still hung unresolved over the house, and it was there, near 2 in the morning, that a groom burst in without ceremony, his face pale with alarm. "Your Grace, there is a carriage at the eastern gate, unmarked, refusing to identify itself. The gatekeeper says the driver matches the description of a man often seen in Lord Thorne's employ." The Duke was on his feet instantly, all the careful calm of the courtroom replaced by something harder, more immediate. "Rouse the rest of the staff. No one is to approach that gate alone, and no one outside this household is to be admitted under any circumstance tonight. Alara, you will remain here, in this room, with the door secured, until I return. I will not simply wait while you walk toward whatever danger that carriage represents. Alara said, already rising, her chin set with the same stubborn courage that had once, in another life she was only beginning to remember, made her fix a badly tied cravat without permission. Alara. I have spent 5 years as a woman with no name and no history, Alaric, she said, using his given name for the first time, and watching it land on him like a small, startling gift even in the midst of danger. I will not spend the first days of remembering myself hiding behind a locked door while you face Thorn's cruelty alone. We face this together or not at all. He looked at her a long moment, torn between fear for her safety and a fierce, undeniable pride in the fire she had shown him, and finally, reluctantly, nodded. Together then, but you will stay close, and you will trust me to act when action is needed. They found the eastern gate already tense with confrontation by the time they arrived, the gatekeeper standing firm against a driver who refused to lower his hood or state his business, 2 more shadowed figures waiting silently within the unmarked carriage beyond. The Duke's presence changed the air instantly, the driver's bravado faltering as the household's full weight of authority arrived to meet him. You may tell your master, the Duke said, his voice carrying clear and cold across the dark drive, that his courtesy has been received, and rejected. If Lord Thorn wishes to communicate further with this household, he may do so through legitimate channels, in daylight, or not at all. Should this carriage, or any other in his employ, approach these grounds again after tonight, I will consider it grounds for immediate action through the magistrate, and I will not hesitate to pursue it. The driver said nothing, only turned his carriage and departed into the dark, but Alara, watching from beside the Duke with her hand tight in his, understood that this was not truly an ending. It was only the closing of one door, while somewhere in the city, Cassius Thorn was already searching for another. They returned to the house as the first gray light of dawn began touching the eastern sky, exhausted but unharmed, and the Duke ordered the watch maintained through the coming days regardless, unwilling to trust that a single rebuffed carriage marked the end of Thorn's ambitions. Alara, for her part, found that the fear she might once have felt at such a confrontation had been replaced by something steadier, something closer to resolve. She had spent 5 years as a woman erased from her own history, powerless against forces she could not name or fight. She did not intend to spend whatever years remained to her, cowering from a man whose only true power lay in the fear he could inspire in those who led him. You are thinking very loudly, the Duke said, watching her across the breakfast table later that morning. The two of them heavy-eyed, but unwilling to sleep, while so much remained unresolved. I am thinking that Thorn has lost everything he came here to reclaim, Alara said slowly. His claim on my debt, his reputation before the court, and now, it seems, even the small dignity of a quiet retreat. A man like that, stripped of every ordinary weapon, tends to reach for something far less ordinary before he is finished. You believe he will attempt something more drastic? I believe, Alara said, that we should be prepared for exactly that, rather than allow ourselves the comfort of believing last night's carriage was his final move. The Duke reached across the table and took her hand, his expression grim but resolute. Then we will be prepared. Whatever Thorn intends next, Alara, he will find that he is no longer facing a lost woman, with no name and no protector. He is facing my Duchess, and everything I am prepared to do to keep her safe. Thorn's final move came not at night, but in the full, unguarded light of the following afternoon, when Alara least expected it. She had gone, against her better judgment but with 2 footmen in careful attendance at the Duke's insistence, to visit the small chapel where she and Alaric had married, wishing to see it again now that memory had returned to color the plain stone walls with meaning. It was there, in the quiet hush between the pews, that Thorn found her, having somehow learned of her intended visit and arrived ahead of her with a patience that unsettled her more than any open threat could have. Duchess, he said, rising from a shadowed pew near the back of the chapel, his voice carrying an unsettling calm that did not match the desperation she knew must lie beneath it. How fitting that you should choose this place for our final conversation. Alara's footman moved instantly to flank her, but Thorn raised a placating hand, his expression almost weary. I have not come to harm you, whatever your loyal guards may fear. I have come only to speak plainly, one final time, before matters proceed beyond either of our control. You have already threatened this household once, my lord, Alara said, her voice steadier than her racing heart. I do not see what remains to be said between us. Only this. Thorn stepped closer, though he stopped well short of the footman's reach. You believe you have won. A courtroom victory, a reunited marriage, a household closing ranks to protect you. But reputations are fragile things, Duchess, even for dukes. and I have spent a lifetime learning exactly where such fragility hides. I know things about your husband's family, about debts and favors owed in quarters he would rather keep hidden from polite society. I am prepared to make all of it known, unless you convince him to withdraw the complaint currently being prepared against my financial conduct. You would ruin an innocent family's name, Alara said, out of nothing but spite, because you cannot bear to lose. I would ruin nothing that was not already built on convenient omissions, Thorne said coldly. I am merely offering you the chance to prevent it, a small mercy, Duchess, from a man you have wronged rather more than you seem willing to admit. It was, Alara realized with sudden, cold clarity, the desperate gambit of a man who had run entirely out of legitimate weapons and had resorted, at last, to the only one he had left, the threat of scandal against a family that had only ever tried to protect her. I will tell my husband everything you have said, she told him, lifting her chin with a steadiness that surprised even herself, and I do not believe, my lord, that either of us will find you nearly so frightening once he has heard it. She did not wait for his response, turning instead and walking swiftly from the chapel with her footmen close behind, her heart pounding but her resolve, for the first time in this entire ordeal, entirely unshaken. The Duke's reaction, when she relayed the conversation that evening, was not the fear or panic Thorne had perhaps hoped to inspire, but something closer to grim, focused determination. Let him try, Alaric said, pacing the length of his study with restless, contained energy. Whatever old debts or favors he believes he has uncovered, I would rather face them in the open, on my own terms, than allow a man like Thorne to dictate the shape of my family's future through fear alone. I have hidden nothing that cannot survive daylight, Alara. And even if some old, uncomfortable truth were to surface, I would rather stand before it honestly than let Thorne hold it over us like a blade forever. He is desperate, Alara said. I saw it in his face today. A desperate man is dangerous, but he is also, I think, more likely to make a mistake than a patient one. Then we will be ready for whatever mistake he makes. The Duke stopped his pacing and knelt before her chair, taking both her hands in his. You handled him better today than I could have hoped, Alara, braver than I would have asked of you, had the choice been mine to make. I did not feel brave, she admitted. I felt terrified, the entire time. Bravery rarely feels the way we expect it to, he said gently. It is not the absence of fear. It is simply refusing to let fear choose your next action for you. In the days between the chapel confrontation and Lady Whitfield's gathering, the household settled into a strange, watchful calm, each member of staff more alert than usual, each visitor to the estate scrutinized a little more carefully than politeness strictly required. Priscilla visited often during this time, ostensibly for tea and company, though Alara suspected her cousin's true purpose was simply to ensure that neither she nor Alaric spent too many hours alone with their worry. You are both entirely too calm about this, Priscilla observed one afternoon, watching Alara arrange flowers with hands that betrayed only the faintest tremor. I would be pacing the halls and demanding armed guards at every window, were I in your position. We have considered armed guards, Alara admitted, allowing herself a small, weary smile. Alaric decided against it, on the grounds that it would only convince Thorne we feared him more than we wish him to know. A sound strategy, I suppose, though I confess I find it easier to admire from the safety of my own drawing room. Priscilla's teasing faded into something more sincere. For what it is worth, Alara, I am glad beyond words that this house has its mistress back. I mourned you once, you know, quietly, though we had barely been introduced before the accident took you. I cannot imagine what these past weeks have felt like, discovering an entire self you had lost without even knowing it was missing. It has felt, Alara said slowly, considering the question with more honesty than she usually allowed herself, like coming home to a house I had forgotten I owned, familiar in ways I could not explain, until suddenly, piece by piece, I could. The morning of Lady Whitfield's gathering arrived with a nervous energy neither Alara nor Alaric fully managed to disguise, though they attended regardless, unwilling to allow Thorne's lingering threat to dictate the shape of their lives any further than it already had. Whatever happens tonight, Alaric told her, as their carriage approached the brightly lit entrance of the Whitfield estate, know that I do not regret a single moment of the past weeks. Not the courtroom, not the threats, not even the fear. Finding you again was worth every difficulty that came with it, and I would face Thorne 100 times over rather than lose you a second time. You will not lose me, Alara said, taking his hand as the carriage rolled to a stop. Whatever Thorne attempts tonight, we face it as we have faced everything else, together. The confrontation that finally ended Thorne's campaign came 3 days later, At a gathering hosted by Lady Whitfield, the very ballroom where his first public threat had been issued weeks before. He arrived uninvited, forcing his way past a startled footman with the wild, unraveling energy of a man who had exhausted every careful strategy and had nothing left but recklessness. "Ashgrove," he called across the crowded room, his voice carrying an edge of something close to madness, loud enough that conversation stuttered and died around them, every eye in the ballroom turning toward the unfolding scene. "I have given you every chance to settle this quietly. You have chosen instead to humiliate me publicly, not once but twice. I will not allow a third humiliation to pass unanswered." "Lord Thorn," the Duke said, stepping smoothly between Thorn and Alara without visible alarm, though his voice had gone low and dangerous. "You are making a considerable spectacle of yourself in front of half of London's most influential families. I would advise you to consider very carefully what you say next." "I have considered it a great deal," Thorn said, and from his coat he withdrew a folded packet of papers, brandishing them toward the gathered crowd like a weapon. "These documents detail certain financial arrangements made by your late father, Ashgrove. Arrangements I suspect you would rather the ton never learned of. Debts settled through favors that skirted rather close to the boundaries of the law. I wonder how quickly your precious Duchess would find her welcome here should the full extent of your family's history become common knowledge." A ripple of shocked murmurs spread through the ballroom, and Alara felt her stomach drop, though she forced herself to remain steady beside the Duke, refusing to give Thorn the satisfaction of watching her flinch. "Read them then," the Duke said, to the visible surprise of nearly everyone present, including, judging by the flicker in his eyes, Thorn himself. "Read your papers aloud, Lord Thorn, before this entire room, if you believe they contain anything I have not already accounted for." Thorn hesitated, clearly having expected panic rather than calm invitation, and in that hesitation, the Duke pressed his advantage. "My father was not a perfect man," Alaric continued, his voice carrying clearly across the silent ballroom. "He made arrangements in his youth that I am not proud of, and which I have spent years quietly settling and correcting since inheriting his title. I have never claimed otherwise to anyone who asked me directly, and I do not intend to begin hiding it now, simply because Lord Thorn has decided to wield it as a threat rather than a fact. Whatever is written in those papers, my lord, I suspect it will surprise this room rather less than you are hoping, and will damage my family's reputation rather less than it will reveal the lengths to which you are apparently willing to go to punish a woman for the crime of refusing your cruelty." The room's attention, which had briefly wavered toward scandal, began instead to turn, slowly and unmistakably, against Thorn himself, the assembled lords and ladies recognizing, perhaps for the first time in full public view, the shape of the desperation driving his every action. "You would have this room believe you are without fault," Thorn said, his composure fraying visibly now, his voice rising with the particular shrillness of a man who feels the ground shifting irreversibly beneath him. "You forget, Ashgrove, that I hold considerable influence in this city. Influence you would do well not to underestimate." "I do not underestimate it," the Duke said. "I have simply stopped fearing it. There is a considerable difference, my lord, and I suspect you are only now beginning to understand it." It was Justice Colby himself, present at the gathering as an old friend of Lady Whitfield's, who stepped forward at last, his expression grave. "Lord Thorn, I would remind you that a formal review of your financial dealings, ordered by this very court 3 days past, remains ongoing. I would strongly advise against providing this room with any further evidence of the coercive tactics you appear disturbingly practiced in employing. Whatever you believe you hold over the Duke's family, I suspect it pales considerably beside what my own investigators are already uncovering regarding your own." Thorn's face drained of every remaining trace of color. He looked for one long suspended moment, like a man realizing all at once that every avenue of retreat had quietly closed behind him, while his attention remained fixed on the single door he had been so desperate to force open. He said nothing further. He simply turned, the folded papers still clutched uselessly in one trembling hand, and walked from the ballroom for the final time, his footsteps no longer echoing with the confident authority they had once carried, but with the small, hollow sound of a man who has finally, completely, lost. The silence that followed his departure lasted only a moment before Lady Whitfield, with the practiced grace of a hostess determined not to let scandal ruin her evening entirely, called for the orchestra to resume, and slowly, gradually, the ordinary business of the ball returned, though every conversation now carried an undercurrent of astonished, admiring gossip about the Duke and his remarkable resurrected Duchess. Several of the ladies who had once regarded Ilara with open suspicion now approached her with careful, apologetic warmth, offering congratulations that felt equal parts sincere and self-serving, eager to align themselves with the winning side of a scandal they had, until moments ago, been content to watch unfold from a comfortable distance. Ilara accepted their courtesies with the same steady grace she had shown Thorn himself, neither cold nor overly forgiving, simply present, simply herself, in a way that felt, after so many weeks of uncertainty, entirely her own choice to make. "It is over," the Duke said quietly, drawing Ilara close against his side as the music swelled around them. "Truly, this time." "I believe it is," she agreed, resting her head briefly against his shoulder, feeling, for the first time since the auction hall's gavel had fallen so many weeks before, something like genuine, unguarded peace settle into her chest. In the weeks that followed, word came that Thorn's financial dealings, once fully investigated, proved considerably more extensive and considerably less legal than even Justice Colby had suspected. His fortune seized, his standing in society collapsing entirely, as former associates rushed to distance themselves from a man now facing serious criminal charges rather than mere disgrace. He would trouble no household again, least of all the one he had once so carelessly believed he could claim as his own. Mrs. Abbott wept openly the first morning Ilara descended to breakfast and greeted her, without prompting, as Your Grace rather than Miss Whitmore, the old housekeeper's careful, rehearsed warmth finally settling into something unguarded and true. Bess, the young maid whose loose tongue had first stirred Ilara's suspicions weeks before, was rewarded with a small increase in wages and a private grateful word from the Duchess herself, who had not forgotten how close that single unguarded sentence had come to setting the whole truth loose far sooner than either of them expected. For Ilara and Alaric, the return to ordinary life felt, in its own quiet way, more remarkable than any courtroom victory or ballroom confrontation. She moved through the house now not as a guest uncertain of her welcome, but as its rightful mistress, memory returning steadily enough that most days felt, at last, entirely her own again. The locked room at the end of the hallway was locked no longer, its curtains thrown open to let in ordinary daylight, its dust swept away, its quiet grief transformed slowly into quiet, living joy. 5 years, the Duke said one evening, as they sat together in the small library where she had once, unknowingly, rediscovered a shelf of poetry worn soft from her own long-ago handling. 5 years I spent visiting an empty grave, believing the best part of my life had already ended. "And now?" Ilara asked, settling against him with the easy familiarity of a woman finally, fully at home in her own history. "Now," he said, pressing a kiss to her hair, "I find I have simply been waiting, the whole time, for it to properly begin." Outside the library window, the garden that had once looked wild and untended through Ilara's eyes on that very first evening, now showed the early, careful signs of new planting, rows of bulbs pressed into the cool autumn earth by a gardener under Ilara's own quiet direction, promising color and life again, once winter had passed, and spring finally returned to claim the grounds. She had chosen them herself, walking the beds with Mrs. Abbott at her side, remembering, piece by piece, which flowers she had once favored and why, and finding, in that small and ordinary task, a happiness so complete it startled her. "You are smiling," Alaric observed, watching her from across the room. "I am thinking of spring," she said, "of everything this garden will look like, once it finally blooms again. I find I am no longer afraid of waiting for it," he said, crossing to join her at the window, his hand finding hers with the easy, certain familiarity of 5 years remembered and reclaimed. "Not when I know, this time, exactly who will be waiting beside me." Together, they watched the last of the autumn light fade slowly over the garden, two people who had lost each other once to circumstance and cruelty, and found their way back through courage, patience, and a love neither distance nor forgetting had ever truly managed to erase. Spring arrived at the Ashgrove estate with a suddenness that caught even the gardeners by surprise, the bulbs Ilara had planted through the last cold weeks of winter breaking the soil almost overnight, filling the beds beneath the library window with color she had chosen half from memory, and half from a fresh, deliberate joy in choosing anything at all for herself again. A full year had passed since the morning Lord Thorn's carriage had first stopped outside the auction hall, and the household that had once stood so quiet and grieving now moved through its days with an easy warmth that Ilara sometimes still marveled at, as though she had woken into a life she had once only dreamed belonged to someone else. "You have that look again," Alaric said, joining her at the breakfast table with the particular fond amusement he reserved for mornings when he caught her lost in thought over her tea. "What look?" The one that means you are remembering something new. He settled into his chair, watching her with quiet delight. Go on then. What has returned to you today? Nothing so significant, she admitted, though her smile suggested otherwise. Only that I remembered, quite suddenly while I was dressing, that I once had a habit of humming while I worked at my needlepoint, badly, and entirely off-key, and that you used to tease me mercilessly for it. I did, Alaric confirmed, laughing. You were, and remain, a truly terrible singer, my love, though I would not trade the sound of it for all the finest voices in London. Their days had settled into a rhythm neither of them had dared to imagine possible during those uncertain weeks of the previous autumn. Mornings began, more often than not, with quiet breakfasts such as this one, followed by the ordinary business of running a large household, correspondence to answer, tenants to visit, small disputes among the staff to settle with patience and fairness. Afternoons Alara often spent in the garden, or in the small library where she had first, unknowingly, rediscovered a shelf of poetry that had once belonged to her. And evenings, when the weather allowed, found the two of them walking the estate's grounds together, unhurried, content simply to be in each other's company after so many years spent apart without even knowing it. Do you ever think of the auction hall? Alara asked one such evening, as they walked the same garden path where the locket would later be returned to her. That first day, it feels, now, almost like it happened to someone else entirely. I think of it more than I let on, Alaric admitted. Not with sorrow, not any longer, but with a strange kind of gratitude. Had Thorn not attempted to claim you that day, had I not happened to attend that particular sale for reasons I can barely recall now, I might never have found you at all. Sometimes the cruelest circumstances lead, however improbably, to the greatest mercies. A strange sort of mercy, Alara said, wrapped in so much fear and cruelty first. Perhaps the best mercies often are, he said. We rarely recognize them as such until we have already survived whatever pain came before. It had become, over the past year, a familiar and beloved ritual between them, these small returning fragments of memory, each one arriving without warning. A favorite dish recalled at the sight of a particular market stall, a childhood lullaby remembered while walking past a nursery window, the name of a beloved horse she had ridden as a girl surfacing unbidden one afternoon in the stables. Where each fragment had once arrived, tangled with grief for the years she had lost, they had slowly, gently, become instead a source of quiet celebration, each one a small piece of herself restored, rather than a reminder of what had been taken. Lord Thorn's name had not troubled their household in many months. His trial, conducted with considerable public attention through the winter, had ended in a conviction that stripped him of both fortune and standing entirely. His considerable estate ceased to repay the many families he had exploited through the years. His name reduced, in London's ever-shifting gossip, from something to be feared to something to be pitied, and eventually, mercifully, to something simply forgotten. Alara found she rarely thought of him at all now. His once looming shadow shrunk down to nothing more than an unpleasant memory from a difficult chapter already closed. Mrs. Abbott, too, had settled fully into the easy warmth of a household restored, no longer performing the careful, rehearsed courtesy she had once shown a ward she dared not openly recognize, but offering instead the genuine, motherly fondness she had clearly been holding in reserve for years, waiting for the day her true mistress might return to receive it. Bess had been promoted, at Alara's particular request, to lady's maid, and proved, despite her occasionally loose tongue, remarkably skilled at her new duties, fiercely loyal to the Duchess whose secret she had so nearly, unknowingly, revealed too soon. Priscilla visited often still, her friendship with Alara having deepened over the past year into something as close and easy as true sisterhood, and it was during one such visit, in the warm early days of that same spring, that she arrived with news that set the whole household buzzing with fresh excitement. I am to be married, Priscilla announced, scarcely through the drawing-room door before the words tumbled out of her, her usual composure entirely abandoned in favor of open, giddy delight. Lord Ferrus has finally asked, after nearly a year of the most maddening indecision, and I have accepted, and I insist that both of you attend, and that Alara help me choose flowers, since her garden has become the envy of every hostess in London. The wedding, held that summer beneath a sky so clear and blue it seemed almost designed for the occasion, brought the whole of the Ashgrove household together in celebration once more, and Alara found herself, standing among the gathered guests with Alaric's hand warm in hers, struck by how completely her life had transformed from the frightened, debt-burdened woman who had once stood trembling in an auction hall, uncertain of her own name, let alone her future. She spent the afternoon before the ceremony helping Priscilla dress, fastening the long row of small pearl buttons down the back of her gown with careful, practiced fingers, and found herself unexpectedly moved by the ordinary intimacy of the task. Two women who had become true friends over the past difficult year, sharing a quiet, happy moment neither of them could have predicted when they first met beneath such strange and painful circumstances. "You have given me back my cousin," Priscilla said softly, catching Ilara's eye in the mirror before them. "He was a different man before you returned to him, Ilara. Kind still, and dutiful, but hollow, somehow, in a way I do not think even he fully understood. I do not know how to thank you properly for restoring him so completely, simply by surviving long enough to be found again." "You need not thank me," Ilara said, her own eyes bright with unexpected emotion. "I owe him, and this family, rather more than I could ever repay in return." "Then let us simply agree," Priscilla said, smiling, "that we are both considerably fortunate, and leave the matter of debts entirely behind us, where it belongs." "A toast," Alaric said later that evening, once the formal ceremonies had given way to quieter celebration, raising his glass toward Priscilla and her new husband with genuine warmth, to love that survives every obstacle circumstance places before it, and to the courage it takes to claim it fully, once found. Ilara raised her own glass, catching his eye across the small gathering, and felt, not for the first time that year, an overwhelming gratitude for the strange, painful, ultimately redemptive path that had led her back to this exact life, this exact man, this exact quiet happiness she had once believed lost to a river's cold current 5 long years before. It was later still, as the celebrations wound down and the last guests departed into the warm summer night, that Alaric drew her aside into the quiet of the garden, the same garden she had rebuilt with her own careful hands over the past year, now blooming fully in the soft evening light. "I have something for you," he said, reaching into his coat and withdrawing a small, familiar box. Ilara's breath caught as he opened it to reveal the locket, cleaned and polished now, its engraving still clearly legible in the fading light. "Always." "I had it repaired," he said quietly. The clasp had grown worn, from 5 years of a stranger's hands opening and closing it, searching for an answer it could never quite give her. "I thought, now that you have found your answer, it deserved to be made whole again." She let him fasten it around her neck, her fingers finding the familiar weight of it against her collarbone, no longer a mystery to be puzzled over in lonely candlelight, but simply, finally, a promise fulfilled. "I love you," she said softly, turning to face him fully in the fragrant summer dark, "not only as I once did, in whatever life I cannot fully remember, but as I do now, having chosen you again, knowingly, completely, with every part of myself finally returned to me." "And I love you," Alaric answered, drawing her close, "exactly as I always have. Through every year I spent grieving a grave that held nothing at all, and through every day since that has proven, again and again, that some loves are simply too strong for circumstance, or cruelty, or even time itself to fully erase." Above them, the first stars had begun to emerge against the deepening blue of the summer sky, and somewhere in the house behind them, the sound of laughter still drifted faintly from the last lingering wedding guests, a house no longer haunted by grief and empty rooms, but filled, at last and completely, with the warm, ordinary, hard-won happiness of a family finally whole again. They stood together a long while in the quiet garden, saying nothing more, needing nothing more. Two people who had lost everything, and found their way back to each other regardless, ready now for whatever ordinary, extraordinary years still lay ahead of them. Inside, the last guests finally took their leave, and Mrs. Abbott began the familiar, comfortable work of closing up the house for the night, humming softly to herself as she moved from room to room extinguishing candles. Somewhere above, the nursery that had stood empty and unused for 5 long years now waited, freshly prepared, its small crib polished and ready. A secret Ilara had only just begun to share with her husband that very week, watching his face transform with a joy so complete, it had brought them both to tears in the quiet privacy of their own chamber. There would be time enough, in the months ahead, to share that particular happiness with the rest of their family and their household. For tonight, it remained theirs alone, one final quiet gift among so many others, a promise of the life still unfolding before them, chapter by chapter, exactly as it was always meant to.